The crystal chandelier above my dining table caught the afternoon light, casting rainbows across the marble floor of my Beacon Hill mansion. For 63 years, I had built what everyone called the perfect life. A fortune that could buy small countries, a home that graced magazine covers, and respect that opened every door in Boston's elite circles. But on that Tuesday in October, as autumn leaves danced outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, I learned that everything I thought I knew about my world was a carefully constructed lie. The woman I trusted most, who had been in my home for 15 years, was about to destroy everything with words I was never meant to hear. My name doesn't matter anymore, not after what happened. What matters is that I was Margaret Whitmore's daughter, heir to a textile fortune, and I believed I had earned every privilege that came with it. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who prided herself on reading people, on building business empires through understanding human nature, could be so completely blind to the snake living in her own garden, that morning started like any other, in my perfectly orchestrated life. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 7 times as I descended the mahogany staircase, my silk robe trailing behind me. The scent of freshly brewed Colombian coffee drifted from the kitchen, mixed with the aroma of warm croissants. Maria always prepared exactly how I liked them. The morning light filtered through the stained glass window on the landing, painting my skin in shades of amber and gold. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been for years. I had no idea I was living my last morning of blissful ignorance. Maria Gonzalez had been more than my housekeeper for 15 years. She was my confidant, my anchor in a world that often felt lonely, despite being surrounded by luxury. While other wealthy women in Beacon Hill cycled through help like seasonal wardrobes, Maria had become family. She knew how I liked my tea, remembered the anniversary of my mother's death, and never judged me for the tears that sometimes came in the dark hours of early morning when the emptiness of my grand house felt suffocating. She spoke with a gentle Puerto Rican accent that reminded me of warm beaches and simpler times, and her laugh could fill rooms that expensive art and imported furniture never quite warmed the day she arrived at my door. She was 32, recently widowed, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much hardship. She carried a single suitcase and a letter of recommendation from the Chamberlain family, old Boston money, who had spoken highly of her discretion and work ethic. I hired her on the spot, something about her quiet dignity reminding me of my own mother. Over the years, I watched her transform from a woman beaten down by life's cruelties into someone who moved through my home with confidence and grace. I paid for her English classes, helped her daughter get into a good college, and considered myself blessed to have found someone so trustworthy. The bitter irony of that trust would soon become the knife that cut deepest. Maria knew everything about my life. She knew about the sleeping pills I took when anxiety kept me awake, about the phone calls from my estranged sister that I never answered, about the loneliness that made me eat dinner alone at a table that could seat 12. She knew where I kept my jewelry, my important papers, my deepest fears. She had keys to every room, access to every safe, and knowledge of every secret. And I trusted her with all of it because I believed that loyalty, like love, could be bought with kindness and generosity. How naive that seems now. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as I found Maria preparing breakfast, her dark hair pulled back in the neat bun she always wore while working. She smiled when she saw me, that same warm smile that had greeted me every morning for 15 years. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," she said, using the formal address that had long since felt unnecessary, but which she insisted on maintaining. "The newspaper is on the table, and your coffee is exactly 3 minutes old, just how you prefer." She moved with the efficiency of someone who had perfected routine, every gesture economical and purposeful. I settled into my usual chair, unaware that this domestic tranquility was about to shatter, like fine china dropped on stone. My social calendar that day was typical for a woman of my position: a board meeting for the Children's Hospital at 10, lunch with the Ladies' Auxiliary at the country club at noon, and a charity auction planning session at 3. These activities filled my days with purpose, or at least the illusion of purpose. I wrote checks that could fund small towns, attended galas where single evenings raised millions for worthy causes, and served on boards where my name carried weight and my opinions shaped policy. To the outside world, I was the epitome of philanthropic success, a woman who had transformed inherited wealth into meaningful impact. The truth was more complicated. These activities were also my escape from the echoing silence of my empty mansion, from the realization that all my money couldn't buy the one thing I truly craved: genuine human connection. I remember thinking that morning how blessed I was to have Maria's steady presence in my life, while other wealthy widows in my social circle complained constantly about unreliable staff. I had someone I could trust completely, or so I thought. She knew my schedule better than I did, anticipated my needs before I expressed them, and maintained my household with a precision that would have impressed military officers. The house ran like clockwork because of her efforts, every surface gleaming, every detail attended to, every aspect of my daily life orchestrated for maximum comfort and efficiency. It was a level of care that felt almost maternal, and I treasured it more than all my expensive possessions combined. But even in that kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of morning routine, something felt different. Maria seemed distracted, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by a focused silence that I attributed to concentration on her tasks. She kept glancing at the clock above the stove, and twice I caught her looking toward the phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked if everything was all right, she flashed that brilliant smile and assured me all was well. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match her words. It was the first crack in the facade, though I was too trusting to recognize it as such. The grandfather clock struck 9 as I headed to my study to review notes for the hospital board meeting. My study was my sanctuary, lined with first edition books and photographs from my travels around the world, furnished with antiques that had been in my family for generations. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden air like tiny sprites. Everything was exactly as it should be, yet I felt an unease I couldn't explain. Like the atmospheric pressure change that precedes a storm, I had learned to trust my instincts in business, but in my personal life, I had grown too comfortable, too confident that my carefully ordered world would remain stable forever. As I prepared to leave for my first appointment, Maria approached, with my coat, her movements somehow more deliberate than usual. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying a note I had never heard before. "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me and my family." The words were appropriate, even touching, but something in her tone made me pause. There was a finality to it that seemed strange for an ordinary Tuesday morning. When I thanked her and mentioned that appreciation went both ways, she looked away quickly, busying herself with straightening magazines that were already perfectly aligned. If I had been more suspicious by nature, I might have recognized that moment as a woman preparing to say goodbye. But I had lived too long in the comfort of assumed loyalty to read the signs that should have been obvious. The children's hospital board meeting consumed my morning with discussions of budget allocations and new wing construction plans. I found myself less engaged than usual, my mind drifting back to Maria's strange behavior. During a break, I called home to check on a delivery I was expecting. But the phone rang several times before Maria answered, her voice slightly breathless as if she had hurried to reach it. When I asked if everything was fine, she assured me it was, but again, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you wake. The meeting dragged on, filled with the usual political maneuvering and ego battles that marked all such gatherings. But my attention kept wandering home, to Maria, to the nagging sense that my carefully ordered world was somehow shifting beneath my feet. Please leave a comment with the word betrayal if this story is resonating with you so far. Don't forget to subscribe to hear how this devastating discovery unfolds, because what I learned next changed everything I thought I knew about trust. Lunch at the country club was an exercise in maintaining appearances while my mind raced with undefined anxiety. The dining room buzzed with the usual gossip and social positioning that marked gatherings of Boston's elite women. Patricia Caldwell regaled us with stories of her recent European cruise, while Elizabeth Morrison complained about her daughter's choice in husbands with the dramatic flair of someone who had never faced real hardship. I smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, but their conversations felt like background noise to the growing unrest in my chest. Something was wrong at home. I could feel it with the same certainty that had guided me through successful business deals for decades. But I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was being paranoid, that 15 years of faithful service had earned Maria more trust than my sudden suspicions warranted. The afternoon charity auction meeting was held in the conservatory of the Hartwell estate, surrounded by exotic plants that thrived in the controlled climate of wealth and privilege. We discussed which local celebrities to recruit as auctioneers, which items would generate the highest bids, and how to maximize publicity for our cause. It was the kind of work that once energized me, the satisfaction of organizing events that would raise hundreds of thousands for children's charities. But today, I felt disconnected from it all, as if I were watching the proceedings through glass. Every few minutes, I found myself checking my watch, calculating how long until I could return home, and reassure myself that my fears were unfounded. The other women noticed my distraction, asking with varying degrees of genuine concern if I was feeling well. I assured them I was fine, but we all knew it was a lie. In our social circle, fine was what you said when your world was crumbling, but admitting weakness was unthinkable. The drive home through Beacon Hill's historic streets usually brought me peace. The brick sidewalks lined with gas lamps, the carefully preserved Federal and Victorian architecture, the sense of permanence that came from living among buildings that had weathered centuries of change, all of it normally served as a reminder that some things endured, that stability was possible even in an uncertain world. But that afternoon, the familiar sights felt different, as if I were seeing them through different eyes. The autumn leaves that carpeted the sidewalks seemed less charming and more ominous, like nature's reminder that everything eventually falls. The historic mansions that usually spoke of enduring legacy now seemed like monuments to vanished fortunes, warnings that even the mightiest could fall. I tried to shake off these dark thoughts, but they clung to me like shadows that grow longer as the sun sets. When I turned into my circular driveway, I noticed immediately that Maria's car was still there. Though she usually left by 4 on Tuesdays to pick up her granddaughter from school, the sight should have been reassuring. She was still here, still taking care of my home, as she had for 15 years. Instead, it deepened my anxiety. Maria was nothing if not consistent in her routines, and deviation from schedule was unlike her. I sat in my Mercedes for a moment longer than necessary, studying the familiar facade of my home as if it might reveal secrets I had somehow missed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and for the first time in years, my beautiful house looked almost menacing, like something from a Gothic novel where terrible secrets lurked behind elegant facades. I entered through the front door, my heels clicking against the marble foyer, in a rhythm that usually announced my return to anyone within hearing. But today, the house was unusually quiet. No sound of the vacuum cleaner that Maria often used in the afternoons, no classical music playing from the kitchen radio, no cheerful greeting calling out my arrival. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with meaning I couldn't yet decipher. I called out for Maria, but received no immediate response. My voice echoed in the high-ceilinged space, bouncing off walls lined with oil paintings of ancestors who had built the fortune I now controlled. Their painted eyes seemed to watch me with disapproval, as if they knew something I didn't about the fragility of trust and the price of naivety. The house felt different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. Everything appeared to be in its proper place. The fresh flowers Maria arranged daily, the newspapers folded precisely on the hall table, the afternoon mail sorted by importance on the silver tray. But there was an energy in the air that hadn't been there that morning, a sense of recent activity that had concluded just before my return. It was like walking into a room where an argument had just ended, where the tension still hung in the air. Despite the restoration of surface calm, I moved through the familiar spaces with growing unease, my business instinct screaming that something was very wrong, while my conscious mind tried to rationalize away the fear. As I climbed the stairs to change clothes, I heard it, the low murmur of voices coming from somewhere deep in the house. Maria wasn't alone. The realization hit me like ice water, not because having guests was inherently wrong, but because in 15 years, I had never known her to entertain visitors during work hours. She was professional to a fault, maintaining clear boundaries between her personal life and her responsibilities in my home. The voices were too distant to understand, but there was something about their tone that made me pause on the landing. They weren't the casual chatter of friends catching up, but something more intense, more purposeful, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my heart rate quicken with an instinct older than rational thought. I should have announced my presence, should have called out that I was home, and perhaps offered tea to Maria's guest. That would have been the polite, normal thing to do. Instead, I found myself moving quietly down the hallway, driven by an intuition that had served me well in business, but which I had never needed to apply in my own home. The voices were coming from the direction of my study, growing clearer as I approached. There was Maria's familiar accent, but also another voice, younger, male, urgent. They were speaking in rapid Spanish, their words carrying an emotion that made my chest tighten with dread. Even though I couldn't understand every word, I could hear the excitement, the planning, the careful coordination of something that required secrecy. I pressed myself against the wall outside my study door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Through the crack where the door hadn't been completely closed, I could see part of my desk, my beautiful antique mahogany desk where I conducted business, wrote personal letters, and kept some of my most important documents. Maria was standing behind it, but she wasn't cleaning or organizing as she should have been. She was opening drawers, rifling through papers, her movements quick and practiced as if she had done this before, many times before. The young man with her was holding what appeared to be a small camera, photographing documents that Maria handed to him. The scene unfolding before me was so surreal, so completely at odds with everything I believed about my trusted housekeeper, that for a moment I wondered if I was dreaming. But the conversation I overheard next eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding. Maria was speaking in English now, her words clear and devastating. The bank statements from last month show the pattern of her investments. She moves money every Wednesday after her meetings with the financial advisor. Always the same amounts, always to the same accounts. We have maybe 6 months before she notices anything is missing, maybe longer if we're careful. The young man laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. 15 years you've been setting this up, Aunt Maria. The old lady has no idea she's been paying for her own robbery. The words hit me like physical blows, each one shattering another piece of the reality I had constructed around trust and loyalty and family. Hey there, I know this is getting intense, but trust me, the shocking truth that comes next will completely change how you view loyalty and betrayal. Make sure you're subscribed because what I discovered about my own family will leave you speechless. The floor beneath my feet might as well have been quicksand. Every assumption I had built my life upon was crumbling with each word I heard through that door crack. Maria wasn't just stealing from me, she was orchestrating a long-term financial fraud that had apparently been in motion for years. The woman I had trusted with my life, who had comforted me through my mother's death and celebrated with me during business triumphs, who knew every intimate detail of my daily existence, was methodically destroying me. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically sick. My legs threatened to give out as the full implications began to sink in. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a carefully planned destruction of everything I had worked to build. The young man continued, his voice filled with an excitement that made my skin crawl. The jewelry alone is worth more than most people see in a lifetime. And she keeps photos of all her pieces for insurance purposes, right here in this desk. Look at this necklace, it's worth at least $200,000. She wore it to that charity gala last month, remember? You sent me the pictures. Maria's laugh was bitter, completely unlike the warm sound I had treasured for 15 years. She wore my daughter's college tuition around her neck, and never even realized it. These rich women, they have so much they don't even know what they own. The inventory lists show pieces she hasn't worn in years. She never miss half of what we take. The callousness in her voice, the complete absence of guilt or affection, told me that the woman I thought I knew had never existed at all. They were discussing my possessions like items in a catalog, calculating which pieces could be sold without detection, planning which accounts to target next. Maria knew my financial habits better than I did. She had been observing, recording, preparing for this systematic theft for over a decade. Every kindness I had shown her, every confidence I had shared, every moment of vulnerability had been filed away as useful information for my eventual destruction. The realization that I had been living with a stranger, that the person I trusted most in the world was actually my greatest enemy, was more devastating than any business loss I had ever suffered. This wasn't just theft, it was the complete annihilation of my ability to trust my own judgment. The cousin in Miami has the buyer lined up for the paintings in the living room, the young man continued. She says the old lady keeps telling everyone their family heirlooms, worth at least $500,000 for the collection. We can have reproductions made for less than $5,000 each. She's so isolated, so lonely, she'll never bring in appraisers or experts. She just wants someone to admire them with her. Maria nodded, adding details that made my blood run cold. She's been taking those sleeping pills for 3 years now, same time every night, same dosage. She sleeps so deeply, she wouldn't wake up if the house caught fire. We have at least 6 hours every night to work without any risk. They were discussing my medication, my sleep patterns, my vulnerability, with the clinical detachment of surgeons, planning an operation. The conversation revealed a network of accomplices that extended far beyond Maria and her nephew. There was the cousin in Miami handling art fraud, contacts in New York managing jewelry sales, and a web of false identities and accounts designed to launder my stolen wealth. They had been studying my routines, my social calendar, my relationships with financial advisors and attorneys. They knew exactly when I would be out of the house, which rooms I visited regularly, and which valuable items I was likely to notice if they disappeared. The sophistication of their operation was staggering. This wasn't the work of desperate amateurs, but of professional criminals, who had been using my home as their base of operations for years. But what devastated me most was hearing Maria described me as pathetic and desperate for affection. She laughed about how easy I was to manipulate, how hungry I was for companionship, that I never questioned her growing knowledge of my personal affairs. She pays me to be her friend, Maria said with contempt that cut deeper than any knife. She's so lonely she actually believes I care about her problems. Every sob story, every personal crisis, every moment of weakness, I just nod and pretend to sympathize while I catalog everything that might be useful later. Rich women like her, they think money can buy loyalty. They never realized that people like us, we're just waiting for our chance to take what should have been ours from the beginning. The young man was taking photographs of documents from my personal safe, the combination to which I had given Maria years ago for emergencies. Birth certificates, insurance policies, investment statements, property deeds, everything needed to assume my identity or liquidate my assets. They discussed forging my signature, which Maria had been practicing, by copying my writing from personal letters and check stubs. They had samples of my handwriting going back years, enough to create convincing forgeries for bank documents and legal papers. The scope of their preparation was terrifying. They weren't just stealing from me, they were positioning themselves to become me, to strip away not just my wealth but my very identity. I learned that several accidents and mistakes over the past months had been deliberate sabotage, the fire in my garden shed that destroyed financial records I had been storing there, the water leak in my bedroom that damaged a trunk full of important papers, the mysterious computer virus that had corrupted files on my personal laptop. Each incident had seemed like random misfortune, but Maria had been systematically destroying evidence of my assets, while creating chaos that would mask the eventual discovery of their thefts. She had been the perfect employee, always volunteering to handle insurance claims and repairs, always eager to help restore order after each accident. I had been grateful for her competence in managing these crises, never realizing she had orchestrated every one of them. The final blow came when I heard them discussing my will. Maria had photographed it during one of her searches, and they were celebrating the fact that I had named her as a significant beneficiary. $25,000 for faithful service, the young man read mockingly. She has no idea she's going to give us $25 million before she dies. And if we're smart about the timing, we might not have to wait for natural causes. The casual way he mentioned my potential murder made my knees give out completely. I slumped against the wall, my hand pressed to my mouth to keep from crying out. They weren't just planning to rob me, they were planning to kill me, to make it look natural while they looted everything I had spent my life building. Standing in that hallway, listening to the people I trusted most discuss my murder like a business transaction, I felt something inside me die. Not fear, though terror was certainly present. Not anger, though rage would come later. What died was my faith in human goodness, my belief that kindness could be repaid with loyalty, my confidence that I could read people and judge their character. I had built a fortune through understanding human nature, but I had been completely deceived by a woman who had lived in my house for 15 years, the woman who had held my hair while I was sick, who had celebrated my birthdays and mourned my losses, who had been the closest thing to family I had left. She was planning my death with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation. I had to get out of the house before they discovered me. Moving as quietly as I could, I retreated to my bedroom and gathered a few essential items: my phone, some cash I kept in a jewelry box, and the spare car keys from my nightstand drawer. Every sound seemed amplified in the terrible silence. every floorboard creak threatening to expose my presence. I could still hear their voices from the study, now discussing which items to remove that night while I slept under the influence of the sleeping pills they had been monitoring for years. They were planning to stage a break-in, complete with damaged locks and overturned furniture, to cover the theft of several high-value pieces. It would look like a random crime, and I would wake to find myself the victim of burglars who had somehow known exactly what to steal and where to find it. I made it to my car without being detected, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. As I backed out of my beautiful driveway leading to my dream house that had become a den of thieves, I saw Maria appear at the front door. For a moment, our eyes met through the windshield. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm to something that might have been resignation. She knew I had heard them. She knew her 15-year charade was over. But even in that moment, she tried to maintain the pretense, raising her hand in the friendly wave she had given me thousands of times before. The banality of that gesture, the automatic response of someone so practiced in deception, was somehow more chilling than all the threats I had overheard. I drove aimlessly through Boston's streets, my mind reeling from the scope of the betrayal. Every memory of the past 15 years was now tainted with suspicion. Every kindness Maria had shown me, every moment of apparent loyalty, every instance of seeming affection, all of it had been performance. Carefully calculated manipulation designed to position her for this ultimate theft. I thought about all the times I had defended her two friends, who questioned why I gave a housekeeper so much access to my personal affairs. I had been proud of my trust, proud of my ability to see beyond class differences and appreciate Maria's inherent worth. Now I realized I had been advertising my own gullibility, proclaiming my weakness to anyone who cared to listen. The worst part was the knowledge that I had been living with a stranger who knew me better than I knew myself. Maria understood my routines, my fears, my loneliness, my desperate hunger for authentic connection. She had used every piece of personal information as a weapon against me, turning my vulnerabilities into tools for my destruction. The sleeping pills she mentioned weren't prescribed by my doctor. Maria had suggested I try them when I complained about insomnia, had even brought me samples she claimed came from her own prescription. How long had she been drugging me? How many nights had I lain unconscious while she systematically looted my home and photographed my most sensitive documents? I found myself parked outside the police station, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. What would I tell them? That my housekeeper was stealing from me. They would want evidence, documentation, proof of crimes that had been committed with such subtlety that I hadn't noticed them myself. Maria and her accomplices had been careful to take things I wouldn't immediately miss, to forge my signature on documents that wouldn't be scrutinized for months or years, to create the illusion that nothing had changed while they systematically stripped away everything I owned. They had been planning for this confrontation, preparing for the eventual discovery of their crimes by ensuring that by the time I realized what was happening, it would be too late to recover what they had stolen. But I wasn't the naive woman who had left for her charity meetings that morning. The shock of betrayal was crystallizing into something harder, more focused. I had built a fortune from nothing, had navigated the cutthroat world of business and investment, had survived the death of my parents and the dissolution of my marriage by relying on my own strength and intelligence. I had been blindsided by people I trusted, but I wasn't defenseless. Maria and her family had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. They saw a lonely old woman desperate for companionship, but they had forgotten that lonely old woman was also a millionaire who hadn't gotten rich by being stupid. The game was far from over, and they had just taught me all the rules. That evening, I checked into a hotel under an assumed name, paying cash and avoiding any transaction that could be traced. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to turn the tables on people who thought they had already won. As I sat in that anonymous hotel room, surrounded by generic furniture and impersonal artwork, I felt more at home than I had in years. The familiar luxury of my mansion had been revealed as an elaborate prison, beautiful but controlled by someone who wished me harm. This sterile space was honest in its indifference. No one here was pretending to love me while plotting my destruction. I spent the night documenting everything I could remember, suspicious incidents that now made sense, changes in Maria's behavior that I had attributed to personal stress, occasions when she had encouraged me to make financial decisions that would have benefited her ultimate plan. The pattern was clear. Once I knew what to look for, She had been grooming me for this theft for over a decade, slowly increasing her access to my personal information while cultivating an image of absolute trustworthiness. Every crisis she had helped me through had been an opportunity to gain more control over my affairs. Every moment of vulnerability I had shared had been catalogued and stored for future use against me. But as I planned my counterattack, I realized the hardest part wouldn't be exposing Maria's crimes or recovering my stolen assets. The hardest part would be learning to trust again, learning to believe that not everyone who showed me kindness was calculating how to exploit that kindness for personal gain. Maria hadn't just stolen my money and possessions, she had stolen my faith in human decency, my ability to accept love and friendship without suspicion. That might be the greatest theft of all, and the one that would be hardest to recover from. But I was determined to try, because the alternative was to let her win by becoming the bitter, paranoid woman she clearly expected me to become. The next morning, I began the process of taking my life back. I hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent, who specialized in financial crimes and domestic fraud. I consulted with attorneys who dealt with identity theft and organized crime. I changed every password, every access code, every security measure that Maria might have compromised. I began the difficult process of auditing my finances, trying to determine exactly how much had been stolen and over what period of time. But most importantly, I started planning justice for people who had turned kindness into cruelty and trust into theft. The investigation revealed the full scope of their operation. Maria's network included family members in 5 states, professional forgers, and corrupt employees at banks and insurance companies. They had been operating for years, targeting wealthy elderly women who lived alone and relied heavily on domestic help. I wasn't their first victim, and I wouldn't have been their last if I hadn't accidentally overheard their planning session. The sophistication of their fraud was staggering. They had created an entire parallel economy built on stolen identities and forged documents, all designed to slowly drain the wealth of women who had made the mistake of trusting them. But they had also made mistakes, gotten greedy, left digital footprints that a professional investigator could follow. The photographs they had been taking of my documents had been stored on devices that could be traced. The network of accounts they used to launder stolen money had patterns that could be analyzed and exposed. Most importantly, they had continued their operation even after I discovered them, apparently believing that a lonely old woman wouldn't have the resources or determination to fight back effectively. They were about to learn otherwise. The confrontation, when it came, was not what any of us expected. I returned to my house, not as a victim seeking answers, but as a woman with evidence, legal representation, and federal agents backing up my claims. Maria tried to maintain her innocence even as handcuffs were placed on her wrists, claiming that I was confused, that grief and isolation had made me paranoid and delusional. She played the part of the loyal servant wrongly accused right up until the moment when the evidence was presented. Recordings of their conversations, photographs of stolen items, documentation of forged signatures and fraudulent accounts. Legal proceedings that followed were swift and thorough. Maria and 7 of her accomplices were sentenced to significant prison terms. The assets they had stolen were largely recovered, though some pieces, particularly artwork that had been sold overseas, were lost forever. But the financial recovery wasn't what mattered most to me. What mattered was the knowledge that justice had been served, that their victims had been vindicated, and that other vulnerable people would be protected from similar schemes in the future. Rebuilding my life required more than changing locks and hiring new staff. I had to learn to read people again, to distinguish between genuine affection and practiced manipulation, to accept help without surrendering control of my life to others. I downsized my living arrangements, choosing comfort over ostentation, and began building relationships based on shared interests rather than need and dependency. I volunteered at organizations that helped elderly people protect themselves from fraud, using my experience to help others avoid the trap I had fallen into. Most importantly, I learned to value my own company, to find peace in solitude, rather than desperately seeking connection with people who might exploit that need. The Maria who had lived in my house for 15 years had never existed. She was a carefully constructed character, designed to exploit my loneliness and generosity for criminal purposes. The real Maria was someone I never knew, a woman capable of extraordinary deception and casual cruelty, someone who could simulate affection while planning murder with equal skill. Learning to accept that reality, to acknowledge how completely I had been deceived, was perhaps the hardest part of my recovery. But it was also liberating, because it freed me from the obligation to trust blindly, to assume the best of everyone, regardless of evidence. Today, my life is smaller but more authentic. I have fewer possessions but more genuine relationships. I live in a modest apartment instead of a mansion, but I sleep peacefully without medication, secure in the knowledge that no one is plotting against me in the next room. I've learned to appreciate simple pleasures, a good book, a conversation with a friend who asks for nothing but companionship, the satisfaction of helping others avoid the pitfalls that nearly destroyed me. The wealth that Maria and her family tried to steal has been largely recovered. But more importantly, I've recovered myself, the strong, intelligent woman who built that fortune in the first place. The experience taught me that betrayal is most devastating when it comes from those we trust most completely. But it also taught me that survival is possible, even after the most complete deception. Human beings are remarkably resilient, capable of rebuilding not just their circumstances but their fundamental faith in goodness and possibility. I may be more cautious now, more selective in whom I trust, but I haven't allowed Maria's cruelty to make me cruel in return. That, perhaps, is the truest victory, refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your own light. If this story has touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about trust, betrayal, and the strength it takes to rebuild after devastating deception. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was not who they seemed to be? How did you find the courage to trust again? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your words might help someone else who's facing similar challenges. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected ways of life can test our strength. Next week I'll be sharing another powerful story about family secrets and the courage it takes to confront painful truths. Until then, remember that no matter how completely we may be deceived, we always have the power to reclaim our lives and write our own endings.